Well, good morning again, Jane Matt Conant here.
Good
Sutter
morning.
County.
Oh, yeah. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'd rather see you. That'll be the next time. I think this is the time that I would say, if you're not going to speak, perhaps it would be helpful if you muted your mic. I'm the one that usually sneezes, so I'm going to try not to do that. I either ask for that or someone needs to mute. Now, those of you who are sitting there in the room, the one in the jacket and turquoise shirt, I can see you. I can see the folks at the table taking sign-in. I can see Ruth, but the rest of you I cannot. So if it's okay with you, that's fine, but I won't know if you're raising your hand to talk. There's a podium there that just is blocking my sight view. So either move toward the center. Oh, sir, you don't have to move because I can see you. I can see you. I have to do this to see you, Mr. Eric.
Oh, wait, but I can't see you. Can you? No, just kidding. Everyone's over here.
It looks a little bit like church where no one's in the front row. Are we good with everyone? Okay, thank you. I'm getting a signal from the folks doing our sound system. We have someone that can actually operate a sound system today. Thank goodness. Those of you who were at the last meeting know that it was very challenging. So I have already welcomed, so let me officially open this meeting of a workshop, a board workshop, July 15th, 2022. And I'm going to ask Mr. Jones to call the roll, please.
Board Member Griego.
Here.
Board Member Ramirez. Board Member Countryman.
Present.
Secretary Johnson.
I'm here. Good morning.
Vice President Valines.
Here?
President Dolan.
I'm here. Can we verify that Board Member Ramirez is here? Do you have a Tim Ramirez who's logged on?
President Dolan, this is Brian. He's not. He just texted me for the ID and password again. It wasn't working for him somehow, so I'm going to send it to him. He'll be on shortly.
Okay. So we do have 6 board members. We have a quorum. That is the compilation of the board. At present, we have 1 vacancy, so thank you all. I'm going to take my prerogative as the president to take about 5 to 7 minutes to do something that is not workshop related. And as I speak, I think you'll understand why. On our board agenda, we do have a closed session. And we have already taken it. The board has already taken it. And that closed session is pursuant to the authority of the government code. The board will consider the appointment and recruitment of the executive officer. Although many of you have heard the news, the board would like to officially announce, sadly, that our executive officer, Leslie Gallagher's last day will be Friday, July 22nd. That would make today her last board meeting that she will attend. That's why I am doing this today. We absolutely hate to see Leslie go, but we certainly understand the reasons that she is choosing to move on. She will be joining her family in San Diego, and she has accepted a position with the city of San Diego. Leslie was appointed, so the city of San Diego is getting a great one. Leslie was appointed by the board as the interim executive officer from her position at that point as the attorney for our organization, and that was in the spring of 2014. We viewed ourselves as pretty smart, and we moved her from interim to executive officer in 2015. At that time, the 2017 plan update was underway, getting underway. And the board really wanted to do a much better job in partnership with DWR's plan team for outreach, information, and collaboration, and improve the process from the 2012 plan. And I just feel the need to say that the development of the 2012 plan was done before any of us who are now on the board were on the board. But we did finally do a pretty good job, in my opinion, with the process of adopting that plan, but wanted to improve with the update. So we relied on our executive officer to do that. And she did perform. And so did all of our stakeholders and DWR, and we did a good job. Our efforts for work on the plan, as well as developing a strategic plan and trying to fulfill its goals and strategies, improve in an operation of our responsibilities, authorities, and goals, really were advanced because of our executive officer, and we thank you for that. Also, the board desired to build a stronger, more positive collaborative relationship with our local maintaining agencies to help facilitate actions that are important to improve the resilience and the flood protection system throughout our Central Valley. And I think we have made great progress with that. We appreciate and acknowledge the partners of our local maintaining agencies, and particularly the quality and importance of the regional flood management planning efforts. During her tenure, Leslie led the charge of the development of an organizational plan for this organization that serves as a blueprint that we continue to follow so that we can achieve adequate staff, so we can more effectively, and we already are as effective as we can be, but more effectively achieve our permitting and other regulatory functions. She also accomplished recruiting and hiring a very excellent, hardworking staff who have a commitment to collaborate, to communicate, to innovate, and get the job done. She led the staff through the board's adoption of the 2012 update and the transformative process in terms of involvement that we will, and I hope this board will, and we hope all into the future, working with local entities, broad scale, active recruitment, and stakeholder output and support for the regional flood management plans. Leslie has been an exemplary representative of this board before state agencies, with local government, with our stakeholders, and with the federal government. She has been an officer, a board and officer of the National Association of Flood and Stormwater Management organizations. I don't get that right. National Association of Flood and Stormwater Management. And her involvement of that has improved the organization, in my opinion. It's a good one anyway. But it also has helped us have connections at the federal level so that our voice and the needs of California and the Central Valley can be heard. And we thank her for being involved with that. Leslie leaves the board and our staff in a great position to move forward. And we are very appreciative of that. We're sorry to see her go. She certainly leaves us in a better position. We have a great staff, and we thank her for her commitment and dedication to the board, to the members, to the public, and to the mission of accomplishing protection of lives, property, and improving the environment. So thank you, Leslie. I'm going to just have a few comments. Mr. Shapiro, you're waving your hand. Oh, thank you. Okay.
Okay.
It does. Good morning.
Good morning. I had indicated on my card to speak under public comment, but you jumped into this item, and I'm grateful because this is the item I wanted to speak on. So on behalf of the California Central Valley Flood Control Association, your non-federal, non-state partners in this business we do of flood control, I've been asked to come and to say a few words thanking Leslie for her dedication and her good work over the years. Like you, Madam President, I understand the draw of family and being together, and congratulations belatedly on your marriage and your ability to actually come together and live in the same city effectively and work in the same city. We're grateful for the work you've done in outreach to the local stakeholders, to the local maintaining agencies. We've all been part of this evolution of trying to bring flood protection into the 21st century, hopefully the 22nd century eventually. And we have appreciated the outreach that you did over the years. I'm struck that in an effective organization, you never really can assign either blame or appreciation to the right people, right? Because the organization hopefully works effectively. And so whether it was under the former president, Mr. Edgar's leadership, or your current leadership, Jane, or Leslie's leadership of staff, or the effective functioning of the board, or an effective staff, it works, and we're grateful for that outreach that you've done and that partnership you've tried to build, and we will remain your partner to the board members under whatever future leadership occurs. So on behalf of the association, Leslie, congratulations and thank you for the good work you've done.
Mr. Reinhardt, did you want to speak now or later? I would put you on the spot. This really is an open mic time because it is a workshop, but I can see a lot of smiling faces, and we'll take a little break for hugs. Good morning.
Thank you, Madam President. Rick Reinhardt with MBK Engineers here today on behalf of the Flood Control Association, and I also want to thank Executive Officer Gallagher for her service. I have greatly enjoyed working with her and her collaborative nature of bringing us together to solve flood control problems. She will be missed. I'm actually here to talk about your enforcement group.
Are you at the public comment non-agenda?
Yes.
Can I ask you to wait a bit?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, sir. Board members are going to have a special time with our executive officer, with Leslie. We could call her that now. She's going to be losing her title in another week, next week. So this is a workshop, and I think I've already taken some time. But there's one more thing I do wish to report. One other action that we took in closed session is that the board appointed Sarah Backus to be the interim executive officer. And she will begin when Leslie's departure occurs on the 22nd. Sarah has lived in Sacramento. She's very aware of this region, and she attended public schools here. Then she went on to the University of California, Hastings School of Law, a school that will have a name change, I understand, at some point. Then to the State Attorney General's office in San Francisco, where she worked for 7 years in both natural resources and criminal work. Then she moved to New Mexico as Deputy District Attorney, town of, I'm not going to say it right, Taos. Thank you. And as Director and General Counsel for a small public utility. In 2011, she was appointed to a vacancy of the New Mexico State District Court for the 8th Judicial District. And I understand that would be equivalent to Superior Court for us in California. And then she was elected to that position the following year. As that judge, she presided over all kinds of cases and was appointed to be the water judge for the district court and served as chief judge for 3 years. Her experience is broad. She decided to retire from New Mexico and return to California. And we were delighted to hire her as our staff attorney for the Central Valley Flood Protection Board in March 2019. She will serve as interim executive officer as we work through what we plan to be a very comprehensive search for the permanent replacement of the position. We're very pleased that Sarah is willing to take this on an interim basis, and we will seek to have someone who will be the Leslie Gallagher clone. We're confident in Sarah's ability to take this on, and we look forward to working with you, primarily in the middle of this plan update, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Drainage District feasibility study that is so important to us and to landowners and to the state of California, frankly, and for our commitment to continue to be the public forum and our ongoing process of just improving the way that we do our work and the way we communicate. The board offers Leslie our thanks, our profound gratitude, and we wish her all the happiness that she deserves. And we're going to keep in touch. I've got her private cell, and I got her private email, so we're going to burn that up anytime that we want. And I certainly want to keep in touch with how your lovely daughter is progressing. We welcome Sarah to this interim position, knowing she brings great ability, and we know and trust on her that she's going to lead a very effective, talented staff. So at this point, I would just like her to stand up so that you know who she is. Thank you. May I hug you? We can proceed with the agenda, or we can take a moment. I'll put on the Edgar hat. We'll proceed. All right. Do we have any other announcements or introductions that may need to be made? I always like to acknowledge any elected officials we have. I think Supervisor Conant is online. Any others? Any announcements?
No staff announcements.
Okay, thank you. Then we'll proceed to what is an item on every public agenda, and certainly ours. It's called public comment. And it is the time that someone can raise an issue that is not on the agenda, and they can speak to us, and we do not take action, and we actually don't respond, but we do allow that comment. So, Mr. Reinhardt, this would be your time. Thank you for being cooperative on that. Good morning, again. Push that so the light is lit.
There we go.
Got it.
Good morning again, President Dolan, members of the board. I'm here on behalf of the California Central Valley Flood Control Association. My name is Rick Reinhardt with MBK Engineers. And I want to talk about something that is very unusual for a local agency, a regulated entity to ask, and that's that you increase your enforcement efforts. And I want to talk specifically about why that request is, but I want to be clear on what I'm here to communicate. And it's very rare that you have a regulated entity asked to be more regulated, and we're comfortable doing that in this instance because of the strong partnership that the Flood Control Association and the reclamation districts have with the board, but in particular, how your staff has taken their approach to enforcement issues. They've been very collaborative, they've been pragmatic, and I think that they're doing as good a job as they could given the difficulties of what they're undertaking, and that's bringing property owners into compliance or encroachments into compliance. What we're seeing is that there's a wave of workload coming that you're not resourced for, in our opinion. That workload is documented in the Corps' periodic inspections, in DWR's inspections, and in the system-wide investment frameworks that the reclamation districts have submitted or plan to submit. All of the urban areas in the Central Valley are undergoing FEMA and ULDC findings, and to do that, they have to address high hazard encroachments. That's the next item on the agenda today, is specifically how RD 1000's going about that. But you've also got American River Flood Control District with unpermitted or non-compliant encroachments. They're going to have to be dealt with, and I believe that's an issue for other urban areas as well. I mentioned the system-wide investment frameworks, the SWIFTs that the RDs have prepared. The RDs will work with the property owners to bring them voluntarily into compliance, but it reaches a point when there's going to be a certain percentage that unfortunately are not going to voluntarily comply, and the board's going to have to take enforcement action. Another issue that we've been facing these past few years is pipe inspections, that those require periodic inspections, and the reclamation districts have no enforcement authority to force a pipe penetration owner to do those inspections. We've had a great partnership to date in dealing with those, but there is, I want to say, thousands of these in the system that we have to deal with. And it's not a one-time thing. My memory is it has to be done every 5 years. We also want to reinforce and encourage your staff to continue to reach out to the reclamation districts before contacting the property owners to understand what type of engagement the reclamation districts have already had, the reclamation districts' efforts, so that we can continue that partnership together in bringing these encroachments into compliance. As we look at the workload that's coming, the number of staff you have assigned to this, we're just not seeing how you're going to get it done with your current resources. So we want to encourage you to request increase in funding, increase in staff. But some of this is going to also be temporary in nature, and so maybe permanent staff isn't going to be needed to get through the short-term wave. So is there a way to hire temporary staff or use contract support services to assist you, just trying to be expansive in how you address this workload with the timing of it that's needed to meet, especially FEMA and ULDC certification. So given the next item on the agenda, we thought it was very timely to make these comments, to also reinforce what a good job your enforcement staff is doing, and want you to expand that effort. So thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to provide comments today.
Thank you for your comment. We will keep that. I'm reminded of something that I missed to say at the start of this workshop. It is being recorded. So it's a good thing. We'll have your comments. We will share that with a request for budget augmentation. Does anyone else wish to provide a comment for something that's not on the agenda? Does anyone have their hand up? I don't see any hands up in the room. Does anyone have their hand up online?
No hands online.
Okay, thank you. Then we'll proceed with the board items.
Excuse me, President Dolan, I believe there's a member of the public who is now just filling out a speaker card, so I don't know if you want to.
Did you want to, I actually know who she is. Did you want to say something that's not on the agenda, or are you signing up to speak on an agenda item? Got it.
Just wanted to make sure.
That's okay.
Thank you.
I recognize her, but she would be allowed to speak now. All right. Let me take a breath. We will move to board item, it's number 4A. Reclamation District 1000 will provide information on Seeing Levees Saves Lives campaign. And Mr. Holloman from RD 1000 will be the one to present that. Then we will have board questions, and then we will have comments from others. Mr. Holloman? I'm hoping I pronounced that right. More syllables than king. Good morning.
Good morning, President Dolan, Vice President Fillins. I'm going to give a brief presentation on our Seeing Levees Saves Lives campaign that we developed this year. Next slide. So first off, project overview, community engagement, update on the landscape modification, next steps, and then finally some discussion. So the Seeing Levees Saves Lives campaign is basically, it's a program that will give us the ability to have visibility and accessibility down the levee slope to the toe. As you can see in this slide, some may say, look, you have a house there, you can't see beyond the house. Well, that's correct, but that's a permitted feature. We're looking to modify or remove unpermitted features that will give us the ability to perform inspections throughout the year. And most of our inspections are from a district vehicle, so we don't have time, staff, or resources to walk down each property and inspect. It's all from the vehicle. Next slide. So part 3 of supplemental to Unit 124. This is part of the updated O&M manual that's currently in process for signatures. So we're expecting that to be complete in the next 4 to 6 months. This is basically gives us a vegetation variance. However, we still need the ability to inspect the levees for deficiencies. So it'll give some variance, but most of the vegetation needs to be modified in such a way that we can still see down the slope into the toe. Next slide. This is again talks about the vegetative variance. A lot of the existing hedges and other vegetation presently prevent roadside visibility of the slope to be appropriately trimmed or otherwise relocated or removed. So that's part of what we're doing right now. So this project is not so much removal, it's modification. We're not removing all the hedges, we're modifying so we can look down the slope. Next slide. So here's the zones. So basically what you see right here is zone 1 is essentially 3-foot waterward from the fog line of Garden Highway, minimal grass ground cover. The next zone is zone 2, which is an additional 7 feet from the so essentially 10 feet from the fog line waterward. You have some small herbaceous plants and low-lying ground cover. So essentially not a whole lot. And then zone 3, you're allowed to have a little bit more vegetation, including some trees, some permitted trees. And zone 4 finally is pretty much, I wouldn't say anything else, but there's a lot more vegetation that can be planted and and be there on the levee. Next slide. So in 2010, the district, or the Corps did perform a periodic inspection, and it did conclude that we were unacceptable due to the encroachments and the vegetation. In 2013, there was a re-inspection, and they did see that a lot of our erosion deficiencies have been repaired, so they did give us a minimally acceptable, which there's still some room or some things that we had to address. Next slide. So this is a DWR inspection. As you can see, the unwanted vegetation growth and the encroachments were labeled unacceptable. So this is one of the reasons that we had developed a Seeing Saves Lives campaign to address these encroachments in vegetation. Next slide. So again, DWR does perform spring and fall inspections. There are pictures and documentation related to these inspections. Next slide. So here's two pictures of some of the DWR inspections. As you can tell, the bottom picture does indicate growth that is non-compliant. Next slide. So community engagement. So initially we mailed out a letter indicating what this project entails. Following that, we had multiple meetings with the public, virtual meetings discussing the project scope. And then also, following the meetings with the public, we mailed out additional flyers indicating the dates that we were going to begin the removal and modification. In between those times, I went out and met with a lot of these property owners myself to discuss what we had planned on doing, just an additional correspondence to help them feel a little more comfortable with what we're about to do. Next slide. So out of the 100 high hazard properties, we about 49 to 50 property owners entered into our program, which is quite a bit. So we reduced the risk by about 50%. Now, granted, some properties were unable to contact property owners, whether that be gates or whatever reason, we couldn't get into their property to knock on the door or talk about what we wanted to do. So we still have about 51 property owners have either opted out or we could not enter their property for various reasons. Next slide. So here's a picture, a before and after picture. Obviously the one on the left is a row of oleanders. It's hard to see the picture on the right, but we basically thinned out in between the oleanders to give us visibility. So we did not remove the entire row of oleanders, we just trimmed it. And from the roadside vehicle, you can see down the slope to the toe, which is that's what we want to do. We have to be able to inspect. So that's a picture of that. Next slide. Here we go, another picture. On the left, complete blockage, no ability to see down the slope. On the right, another picture of it thinned out. Now, initially, some of the property owners, we probably went out a little too fast and said we were going to remove everything, which now we've come to realize we don't need a full removal, we need a modification. Next slide. Again, on the left, a row of oleanders. On the right, we trimmed them up. Looks really nice. We can see it on the slope from the vehicle. This is what we're aiming for. We're just not aiming to do a full removal. Next slide. Again, left a bunch of vines on the trees. On the right, everything's thin, looks really good. Homeowner was extremely happy with what we did. Next slide. Again, this particular homeowner asked us to do a full removal, so that's why you see a full removal on this picture, which looks great. A lot of property owners they asked us to do a full removal, which takes a lot more work, but upon their request, we did it. So, next slide. So as of right now, the construction company has completed the removal project as far as the homeowners who have opted in or asked us to perform the removal. So the next step for us is to work with MBK engineers and perform an additional assessment of the 100 high hazard homes and come up with another list of the homes that are not currently compliant. So at that point, we'll bring that information to our board of trustees so we can make a decision on how we're going to move forward with this. Possibly maybe enter into another contract next year, or we just don't know. We need the answer from our board. By December of this year, we have to have all invoices submitted so this project used FMAP funding, so by the end of the year, we have to have all invoices submitted to get reimbursed by the state. Next slide. So we do have much more information on our website at swift@rd1000.org. I think this project was a success. I think, like I said, at 50% reduce of risk, I think that's huge for the first go. So that's all I have to say. Rick, Scott?
Thank you for that. Mr. Reinhardt?
Morning, President Dolan, members of the board. Rick Reinhardt. I'm a consultant, RD1000, but I'm also the certifying engineer for FEMA and for ULDC for the Natomas Basin. And while these items have shown up for over a decade now as deficiencies that need to be corrected, one of the drivers is we have to address high hazard encroachments and vegetation to complete FEMA certification and the urban levee design criteria finding. So MBK did an inspection of the RD1000 levee system, and we identified 100 high hazard encroachments. And so my comments today, I want to make the distinction between addressing the high hazard encroachments and coming into full compliance with what's going to be required in the O&M manual. That there is a distinction. As you saw in the before and after pictures from the construction program, RD1000 is taking a very light-handed approach to simply address the access and visibility deficiency. They're not bringing the levees into compliance with the O&M manual and what's ultimately required in the SWIFT. Ryan, can you go back to the slide that shows the cross-section that's from the O&M manual? There's, yes, thank you. So just a little big picture background. When SAFCA undertook the Natomas Levee Improvement Program, the decision was made to build the adjacent levee in large part to protect the existing vegetation and to minimize the disruption to the homeowners along the Garden Highway. And SAFCA secured a vegetation variance. I believe it was the first in the nation at the time. And what the Corps said is that the trees and landscaping can remain so long as access and visibility was established. And that access and visibility did not exist at the time of the vegetation variance. And the standard for access and visibility is defined in this updated O&M manual, and that's what this graphic is from. This is how the Corps has defined access and visibility, and it's more onerous than what RD1000 is pursuing today. So there will need to be follow-up action in the future for these properties that RD1000 has provided the initial clearing on. I did talk to Ryan Larson, who's the chief of the Corps' operation branch. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here today. He reinforced that the Corps does require access and visibility, and that is defined in their updated O&M manual that, as Gabe said, is being routed for signature now. So hopefully that helps clarify what RD1000 is trying to do here in the near term of this light-handed approach to address the needs for FEMA certification and ULDC, but also make clear that this is step one, and that down the line, additional actions are going to be needed. And RD1000, I think, should be commended for their great success in getting half of these dealt with quickly, and hopefully can continue to work with remaining property owners to reduce the amount that has to come before you for enforcement action. So thank you. Scott?
Through the chair, I have a couple of questions for Rick. Thank you. So my question is, from here on out, for those that participated in the program, who takes care of the maintenance? Is it the property owner or is it the LD?
I defer to that question to Gabe. Property owner. The property owner will be responsible. And so RD1000 will have to continue with their inspections, and if the property owner is not addressing it, just have a dialogue to make them aware of that so that they can take action.
And then thinking about, what the other neighbors, the other 51% is looking at this program, have you thought about using testimonials from the neighbors that did participate to show that, some of these actions that were where they took it all out was because the property owner wanted that, and so they don't just assume that this is the way the state's doing the program?
Not exactly, but Kevin King, the general manager, he's not here today, but he did lead 2 public meetings with the property owners, and he did a rendering showing what the before and after would look like to describe that condition. So it was very clear that it wasn't complete removal, it was thinning. And I think as a result of that, Gabe would need to confirm, but I think there were property owners who did opt out that after the second meeting. Yes, that's correct. Decided to go ahead and allow the work to be done. So we made some incremental progress that way, but there's still a long way to go.
Yeah.
Just let me interrupt a moment. Mr. King is participating virtually, so he's online listening and could talk if someone wants him to.
Yeah, I think he's driving was the challenge, so.
We have a board member doing that as well for family business. So Board Member Grego, you're on still.
Yeah, I think that's great to hear, because there's a lot of misinformation out there when it comes to government, and having your neighbors testify or testimonials that said this is a great program and it's not, so invasive, is, always what I'd want to hear.
Thank you for that. I'll just say that actually misunderstanding, misinformation has been one of our biggest challenges, that understanding what exactly did the Corps approve, what exactly did the Corps require, and that's why we talked about this. There was a presentation at your May board meeting, and that's why we're following up today, is to make sure there's a very clear understanding of what RD 1000 must do. This isn't a discretionary action by RD 1000. If they don't take action, then it falls in your lap to take action. And if you don't take action, then the Army Corps of Engineers can take action to remove the area from PLD 499 eligibility, and it won't be certifiable to FEMA and ULDC. So development will come to a standstill, and flood insurance mandatory requirements will remain.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Madam President, Kevin King would like to speak.
I was going to say that. I needed my board member to indicate she was finished, however. Thank you, sir. Kevin King has his hand up. He's been noted, and he's the general manager of RD 1000. So, Mr. King, you get to wait.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for unmuting. I did want to point out that we did consider on multiple occasions trying to get testimonials from property owners. There was some reluctancy to do that, at least on, to promote it and do, social media posts or, other outreach. But we did ask that was a thought, because we had a number of property owners extremely thankful for our work and what we did for them in providing the almost $500,000 in grant funding to do this work for them. Yes, ongoing maintenance of their encroachments is up to them. In fact, Gabe, our operations manager there today, had multiple people come out and want to give him gifts and thank him for his service and doing this work for us. We would have loved to get their testimonial, but like I said, they were reluctant to do so because I think there's a lot of pressure from other property owners out there that are really opposed to this. There seems to be great fear that this is step one, that is a straight line to step 5, which would be removal of their residential properties. And so they take this extreme approach of, well, if you let RD 1000 or the state in the door now, that it's going to be a straight line to eventual removal of all permitted features as well. And so I think Rick mentioned that we did have a few that had opted out early in the program, but after multiple community meetings, they actually opted back in because they were fearful based on information they were told by their neighbors or the community association out there that this was, a really dangerous approach for them to do, because it would lead to eventual removal of all of their permitted structures as well. And so we were able to, talk to them, work with them, provide them more information, assure them that all we're doing in this project is trying to restore access and visibility. I think we did a fantastic job. Our first notification went out in January, late January of this year, and to reduce the high hazard encroachments by 50% within 6 months. Get the funding in place and have this much cooperation with property owners. I think it's a testament to what local organizations can do with a good approach, a good plan, and good outreach and communication. And so I just wanted to add that, and I'll turn it back over. I saw Scott behind the podium, so be happy to jump back in, but thank you.
Thank you for your comments, sir. Just so folks know, this is the order in which I'm going to call. I will do Mr. Shapiro because he stood up. Then it will be Mr. Arditi, and then Ms. Brown.
Thank you,
Mr.
Madam.
Shapiro.
Thank you, Madam President. And I'm speaking in my capacity actually as General Counsel for RD 1000. Okay. So completing the presentation that Gabe, Rick, and Kevin provided. But as you know, I happen to be privileged to represent a number of public agencies in the region as well as the association, and so I think my comments are going to go a little broader than just RD 1000. This is a Gordian knot. It's very challenging to untie. And as all have explained before me, the intricate combination of federal standards under both the Corps and FEMA, state requirements under your own regulations and permits and the conditions of those permits, and then local desire to implement and achieve for its residents is kind of what creates the problem. And the solution is only achieved by partnership at all three levels as well, right? That's the only way we can get there. And one thing that hasn't been made clear, but I do want to start with, is to acknowledge DWR's role, because DWR provided the FMAP grant that allowed RD 1000 to do this work. So we have an obligation to operate and maintain. In this particular case, we're talking about encroachments that technically should be maintained by the permit holder, right? They have permit for their residents and for vegetation, and it's their obligation to maintain that vegetation, and if they have vegetation that's not permitted, it's their obligation to take it out. But DWR had the forethought to say, yeah, RD 1000, we recognize that sometimes government can make a difference, and they funded us, and we provided the staffing in order to make this work. And so it's that partnership of us working with resources from DWR to implement your regulations to achieve the standards that the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA has set. And in my opinion, this is the only way it's going to work. And as Rick indicated, RD 1000 is the tip of the spear. And in some ways, it's the easiest tip of the spear because we have an adjacent levee next to it, constructed pursuant to modern standards, that is allowing a little bit of the variance in vegetation. Other levees aren't going to have that variance. It's going to be even harder. And so what I want to emphasize here is the need to partner, the fact that that's going to apply for every other district out there, and it's only going to get more challenging. The fact that RD 1000's approach here is to focus on unpermitted encroachments, like vegetation that is not permitted. We're talking about landscaping. We're not talking about native habitat for endangered species. And I guess the final thought that I'd like to leave you with is the analogy to the power lines that run through almost every one of our backyards. We have power lines. They're there because of SMUD or PG&E, depending upon where you live, or maybe another local utility or a local municipal utility district. And we plant trees under those power lines because we like to have vegetation on the boundaries of our property. And every once in a while, we get a hanger on our doors saying the utility company's coming through, and they're going to start trimming the trees. And in that circumstance, the utility company doesn't say, and by the way, if you'd like to opt out, you can, right? The utility company comes in and they trim what they think they need to do. And I'm not telling you guys anything you don't know from experiencing on this board and as staff. The flood control world seems to be different for some reason, right? Everybody acknowledges you can trim trees so there isn't a forest fire. Everyone seems to acknowledge you can go out and do public safety when you're police or you're fire. But on flood, we seem to have a little bit lower level of things we can do. And we need to acknowledge that. We need to partner with our late neighbors. We need to do opt-out programs like we did, giving people the ability to opt out. But at some point, the rubber hits the road, and we need to actually be able to go out there and do the trimming that's required. And so I hate to end with something that sounds ominous. That's not my intention.
Good.
But it is my intention to make the point that this is a first step, and we do need to solve the other 51%. And my hope is that DWR will continue to provide grants, that we can form a partnership with the property owners and develop the trust that hasn't been there in the past. And with that trust, we can do better work going forward.
Thank you.
So thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Board Member Grego, and then I need to offer an apology. Thank you, sir. Yes.
So you went through the process of how this goes in order to, you know, that ultimately takes you out of the PL 8499 program for these folks that I would imagine that that program is very important. So with compliance of 50% of the homeowners, does that meet a requirement that would stop that process from happening? Or do you need 100% compliance from the landowners out there in order to keep those levies in the 8499 program?
So I'm going to encourage Rick to come back up because I think he's the best one to answer.
Okay.
But what I would say is again, there's multiple overlapping standards here. And for PL 8499, what we've said is we will do a SWIFT. We're going to do this systematic, slow approach, and we're doing that.
Right.
The 100 property owners really relates to high hazard, which is both FEMA certification as well as ULDC certification.
Mm-hmm.
And Rick, you're probably the one to speak to the standards of what happens if we can't deal with this issue.
I will ask you to do it perhaps briefly, sir.
Yes,
Thank you.
so the short answer is all 100 must be dealt with for FEMA certification and ULDC, and eventually they will have to be dealt with to comply with the SWIFT.
Thank you.
That's good summation. Any more questions there? Do you? Do my board members online want to ask any questions of RD 1000? Any hands up?
No hands.
Okay, that's good. My apologies to the two landowners. I'm going to call on our staff. I was supposed to do that before. The board does have a role in this. Not today, we're not taking any action. Angelis Jalisco is our staff person, point on that, so she wants to provide some information. Thank you for your patience. Good morning.
Good morning, President Dolan, Board Member Valines, and the rest of the board members. Angeles Calizo, Board Enforcement Section Manager. And, but I thought we had here presented, I actually had a presentation that I was hoping to share with you because I thought it would give you a good overview of sort of what would be the next steps. I think Mr. Reinhardt and the district have spoken on what their efforts and what they've done so far. And I think the next step, if they're not able to get voluntary compliance to address the remaining properties, I do think we can anticipate that the referral will be made to the board to take the appropriate enforcement action to achieve compliance. And so what I thought I would do here for you would be just a kind of a brief overview of what the enforcement process is and sort of how that would go if and when that referral was made to us for this particular properties. So not going to spend too much time here, but this, here in front of you is just establishing the the board's authority for enforcement that is granted to under the Water Code sections 87 and 8709, which essentially, allows us and puts the responsibility on the board to take the necessary actions to abide by the standards that are established and adopted by the board. Next slide, please. Probably not something that you already know, so I will skip through this, but just establishing jurisdiction the board has. In particular, in this case, the second bullet there that speaks to where there is a state plan of flood control. In this case, we're talking about the Natomas Levee Basin, which is encompassed and bounded by 2 federal levees. And then a regulated stream. So it would be the first bullet, actually the first 2 bullets that would be part of this regulatory authority that we would be enforcing. Next slide, please. So just another diagram, again, kind of depicting a typical right-of-way that the board has where we exercise jurisdiction for permitting and enforcement. Next slide. The enforcement process begins, typically we do initiate it with a notice to comply, and again, it's an enforceable process, but those notices have been well received in the past. They are very effective in allowing us to notice and stop work right on in the field when it is occurring and get the property owner notified. And then the next process obviously would be a notice of violation, cease and desist order if the resolution and compliance isn't achieved, and obviously leading to an enforcement hearing if that is necessary. The last 2 bullets there, the cease and desist order and the enforcement hearing, do carry administrative penalties that typically staff will make a recommendation to the board for consideration as part of that enforcement action. And those penalties typically range between $500 to $50,000 depending on the length, the issue before you. Again, there's factors that you may consider, and that's something that's been brought before you in previous times. At that point, if the issue is still not resolved, then it would terminate the board's administrative enforcement process. And then at that point, we would go into the civil process, which would be the AG's office, Attorney General's office, for further assistance. Next slide, please. So when staff does an enforcement action or we receive an inquiry for enforcement action, typically what we like to do is, again, recognizing that we simply don't have the resources to address many of the violations that exist out there. I think Mr. Reinhardt, appreciate his comments that he made earlier. I think they were well received and appreciated. That's something that I think the board has recognized for some time. So what we've tried to do is, prioritize issues and encroachments in the highest risk. So when we receive a request for evaluation of potential enforcement action, one of the things that we try to do is to evaluate the entire property for other potential violations that may exist there. And the intent there is not to be punitive, but really is to make the best use of our resources because we are engaging the landowner. We simply don't want to leave things lingering on at a later time that will have to be dealt with. So we feel that it's best to kind of bring those items to the forefront and make the landowners aware of the other potential violations that may exist there. So we do try to be a comprehensive evaluation of that particular property or issue. And so that could include updating board permits that may not have been updated recently. That could also include getting new permits for things that could be permitted. And then the encroachments go into this different evaluation and categorization. So we kind of put them into 3 different categories. The first one is if it's an unpermitted encroachment that is non-compliant. In that case, that has to be removed. It cannot be modified, it's non-compliant, it can't remain on the system. The second one would be if something could be modified to be code compliant. So in that case, the encroachment would be allowed to be modified, whatever the modification may entail, depending on what it is. And then the necessary permit approvals would have to be obtained as part of that. And then the last one is probably the easiest one, but not one that we encounter too often, unfortunately, which is the encroachment can remain as is with no modifications in place, meaning it meets code, and so therefore just necessary approvals are necessary. So in that case, we would allow the encroachment to remain and then obtain necessary board approval for that. Next slide, please. And I think that was the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you for that. And that PowerPoint can be made available to anyone who wants to peruse it more thoroughly.
Absolutely.
Board members? Thanks. Any online hands up?
No hands online.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Arditi, then Ms. Brown, and then Mr. Eric. Those are my cards. That will be the order. Good morning, sir. Thank you for your patience.
Good morning, Madam President and board members. I am Steve Arditi. I am a member of the Board of Directors of the Garden Highway Homeowners Association. Joining me here today is my neighbor and fellow board member, Melissa Brown, and we will each share a few remarks with you. I first want to echo your comments earlier, Madam President, about the open and collaborative way in which this board and its staff people function. While we still have apprehension about how all this may turn out, we have felt very confident in the good faith and openness and willingness to work with people that you've shown, and we really do appreciate that. As for RD 1000, I first want to acknowledge Mr. Holloman, who just spoke. I'll have another word or two to say about RD 1000, but I want to say Mr. Holloman has been very open in meeting with folks and talking to us, has been very straightforward with us, and we have really appreciated him. The trust issue that we have, however, with RD 1000 begins with the fact that they've stated here at your May meeting that they began developing this removal plan in 2019, yet the first disclosure we got was in January of 2022 with an assertive statement that this is not optional and threatening major penalties if we do not comply. They had in the meantime been doing surveys and making plans and doing all this stuff, never saying a word, revealing a word of it to anybody but themselves. Typically, with a public body, there is first notice of a proposed action. There is then an opportunity for the public to share views, be heard at least, and then a decision follows that. This has been the reverse of that. So while we would love to have a perfect relationship of trust with our reclamation agency, Maya Angelou famously observed once, when someone tells you who they are, believe them the first time. And so that's kind of a problem we're having, just getting over a hump here in working with these folks. Now, there's been reference made to the big new levee that's being built, and I think we all agree that that's a wonderful thing for the entire region. We also believe that this brand-new, big engineered adjacent levee really pretty much obviates the need to remove our shrubs, which provide a modicum of privacy and screening of a very busy highway, which is often traveled at 70 and 80 miles per hour, motorcycles and trucks and all that. And there is evidence that vegetation is not a big problem on levees, especially with this big new one that is now being built. And why they choose just the moment at which that's being completed, and I say being completed, it took me almost an hour to get here this morning because of road closures related to this construction, is something of a mystery to us. Beyond that, reference has been made to this engineering study that has identified these 100 places that are said to be the most hazardous and dangerous. Again, we didn't get that engineering study except by public records demand, which is the basis they cite for making these decisions. And we look around at the places that have been targeted and then others that have not been, and there seems to be little rhyme or reason with regard to visibility of the levee. There are some places, like ours, for example, that do have shrubs, but have two great big wide driveways from either of which you can look down and see almost all there is to see. And there are many other places that have zero visibility, and yet nothing is being proposed for those, including the RD 1000's own office on the Garden Highway, the adjacent Federal Coast Guard platform next door to them, and a large string of condominiums right after that. We spoke to some residents of that condominium complex recently, asked if they were notified of anything, and had heard nothing about this, so nothing is being done about this. So 2 points. One, we question whether it's necessary to remove vegetation. Two, we don't see a rational basis for the way they've chosen. I know they have a rationale which they've shared and they may share again, but those are things that really stand out with us. Now I think I would like to call upon my colleague and neighbor, Melissa Brown, to share with you some very relevant information about issues relating to SAFCA. So I'll, for the moment at least, relinquish the mic to Melissa.
All right, you may do that, and I will as well. Ms. Brown. May I ask if either one of you are responsible for this packet that we received?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
thank you. You're going to explain it, or shall I?
You may explain it, and then I can answer some questions about why we think some of the documents are relevant. Good morning, Board. Melissa Brown.
Good
here.
morning.
Good morning, President Dolan.
Board members have received, and staff, a fairly thick packet that is a letter from the Sacramento Area Flood Control Association, which we usually call SAFCA, to Chair Kennedy, board members, and staff. And it's dated 2022. So that would be to RD 1000. And Appendix L, responses to comments on the draft environmental statement, draft environmental review, probably for the levee project is my guess. Again, the example that we all receive, and it's been on PowerPoints, the diagram of levees, levee inspection by mile fall 2019 report, and 2 photos on a page.
Thank you very much. Let me just say that, and maybe correct President Dolan for a moment. The first in the packet, it's a letter from the Chronic Law Firm to SAFCA.
Oh, thank you for that. I see now that it is
Right.
on the letterhead of Chronic, Moskowitz, Tiedemann, and Gerard.
Correct. And the reason we wanted to call this to the board's attention is just by way of context of what we're trying to do in working through these issues with SAFCA as well as RD 1000. So the letter from the association's law firm, retained law firm, outlines the settlement agreement that the association reached with SAFCA several years ago concerning several of the issues that were relevant to the presentation today, particularly the encroachment issue and the telephone pole issue. And now is not the time to go through, chapter and verse of the settlement agreement. We just want you to know that we are working with SAFCA in an effort to clarify and make sure that the settlement agreement is being complied with. Regarding, and the reason we call it SAFCA, by the way, is there's no other E in the acronym. And so we call it SAFCA. So there you go. So basically, the salient features of our settlement agreement that we wanted to just bring up for today indicate that there should be significant collaboration with SAFCA, with our members, and that they will work with the Army Corps and RD 1000 to encourage appropriate responses to this vegetation issue. And we are concerned that that hasn't happened. So we are in the process of continuing to work with them on that. The relevance of the, and we've just provided copies of the settlement agreement again, just for the board's record and reference. The relevance of Exhibit L, which is Appendix L, I don't think can be understated. We received this document in a public records request, and it is the SAFCA and the Army Corps response to the their environmental impact report with regard to encroachments on the levee. Bottom line is it's our position, and we would encourage your board to adopt this position, that with the new super adjacent levee, that's the levee that's saving lives, not the old Garden Highway unengineered farmer's road that has now become a levee. And so when we talk about the levee toe and being able to look down the slope of the levee, it's basically our position that it's the new levee that should be considered. So even if so that's basically our position there, and we think that the board and others could either reach a regulatory change, a proposal, or an interpretation that would allow that, that common sense, updated, correct view of where the levee toe begins and ends. Secondly, as my neighbor pointed out, there seems to be no rhyme or reason with 100 high hazards. He pointed out his home. Our house is a filled lot. If you cut down everything in front of our house, you could still not see the toe of the levee. So again, while maybe the vegetation, I happen to have lavender, may be not in compliance with RD 1000's interpretation, if you removed it all, you still couldn't see it. And in many of these homes, the permitted structure, the house, as Mr. Holloman pointed out beginning in his comments today, you still couldn't see it because the house is in the way. So why are we doing this if the purpose is to have visibility when it would be impossible given the existing structures, be it filled, be it homes, and so forth? So again, this, I think, comes into the whole concept of how are these identified as high hazard, given these realities that even with complete removal, the purported purpose could not be achieved. And I guess one more point that came up today with Mr. Shapiro regarding the poles, which our settlement agreement called for no poles on the water side of the levee, but only temporary poles. That's happening because the utility lines are being rerouted temporarily, although it will be years, I'm sure, from the existing levee spot. It is my understanding that once those utility poles are moved by SMUD, and in this case they're being moved more toward the water line on our property, that setbacks, that puts back the easement for purposes of the fog line, the Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3. So There may be an issue now with the interpretation of zones 1, 2, and 3 from the fog line and so forth, now that SMUD has moved those poles. So I just think that's something that probably the legal staff or somebody's going to be looking into, and I know we're certainly going to look into that as well. So that's basically our bottom line. We think that the new engineered levee, that's the one that's going to be saving lives. This theme of seeing levees save lives, we think is a little misplaced, and we think that we should modernize the view of the definition of the levee and the levee tow in light of the billion-dollar project that we're all grateful for. Thank you.
Madam President, if I might add one
Yes, sir.
more,
You may.
one more comment here.
Mr. Arditi,
y-
I was just handed something. I don't normally read things that are in chat, but this will keep Mr. King from being called upon. He says, for Ms. Brown's comments about what you just said, not RD 1000's interpretation based on the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So noted what you have to say. I want you to know that and what he did. So we're not making any decision on either one today. So thank you for your information. Thank you, Mr. King. Mr. Arditi.
Thank you
on.
again. I'm just reflecting on Mr. King's earlier remark, sort of making light of concerns some of us have that if this gets done today, what they're demanding right now, that eventually they're going to go to step 2 and step 3 and step 4 and finally take our homes. The truth of the matter is we've been offered no assurance, verbal or written, that even if agreement is reached on this phase, that we're not going to then be facing 2, 3, and 4 as time goes along. And it might be a lot easier to reach agreement with them on this phase if we had some real assurance that they weren't going to be coming back for yet another bite, another bite, and another bite. So far, I've not heard that from them, and I'd like to at least suggest that for their consideration. Thank you so much.
Through the chair.
Member Grego?
That's why I asked the question, you know, how many folks have to be in compliance in order not to go to the next step? And I was surprised, it's 100%. You know, how could you give reassurance when you're not able to get 100%? I mean, I'm sure that they would probably, at least I would, want to give you assurance, but unless 100% of the folks that have been identified as this high hazard area comply, the next step happens.
Well, two responses. First, the suggestion that I was making is that it might be possible for 100%, I can't speak for everybody else, but I'll just speak for myself. Assuming that agreement could be reached on this first phase with 100%, would they then still say, oh, but you know, next year we might come back for another bite, and then next year after that, I think there are some among us who are concerned that even if we don't feel too terribly strongly about this stage, that there may be others. That was what Mr. King was suggesting, and he was suggesting that that's really not something that we ought to be concerned about. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that was sort of what I heard. And so what one possibility I suggest here is if 100% of us could agree on this step, would we then not have to worry about yet another and another and another? Of course, the second question is the rationality of the selections on this list. I mean, that was done behind our backs before we had any idea that this was going on. We got no input into that. So I guess the other point I would make is, how about rolling things back a little bit and having a collaborative process, open, including RD 1000, ourselves. If your board would be willing to participate, that'd be great. And let's try to go through this house by or property by property and see if we can't reach agreement on what's reasonable in terms of both flood safety and the ability to live peaceably in our homes. So again, someone will probably say we're being paranoid. But on the other hand, we have experience. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you for that. Ms. Brown is back, then I have Board Member Countryman who wants
Thank
to
you.
weigh in.
I just had 2 quick points with regard to the comments that Mr. King made regarding how some of the property owners may have felt we were being reactive in terms of this is just a first step or being paranoid. I would point out that at least my notes today from Mr. Holloman or Mr. Reinhardt indicate that this is step 1. So I think our concerns are valid, that this is just the first part of an ongoing effort. And secondly, I just can't let it pass, and I should have brought it up earlier, respectfully to Mr. King's suggestion that we were, some homeowners were, intimidating or stoking fear with other homeowners, and his remarks that that they were feeling pressure, those who did comply. I'm a lawyer in my other life, and so when I hear things like that are purely anecdotal, and when it just, I think, is something that we just must note, that those are pure anecdotes. In every meeting that I've attended with our association, that has not been the message. We have certainly conveyed our concerns because we have heard that this is step 1 and that other things can happen, but certainly there's no pressure put on our neighbors to adopt a certain view at all. And so I just really do take exception to that.
Understood.
Thank you.
And received. The purpose of the workshop is to receive information and comments, and the board's not going to necessarily say we like or don't like them.
I understand.
But we did want to do this so we could hear the information. So thank you. Mr. King has his hand up, and then I'm going to get to you, Mr. Herrick. I haven't forgotten. Oh, excuse me, Mr. King. I'm going to my board member first. Mr. Countryman? Did you raise your hand?
Yeah, I was muted.
Yeah, I know how that
well,
goes.
Frankly, I'd like to hear what Mr. King has to say before I speak.
Okay. Because you said that, I'll call Mr. King. You're usually first, Mr. Countryman. Do we keep Mr. Countryman?
I'm here.
Okay.
I think the
Mr.
video,
King, there you
here we
are.
go.
Okay.
So not on video, but unmuted. So I certainly appreciate the comments from the property owners. And I do want to clarify that my comment about the pressure and the fear is not anecdotal. It was direct quotes from individuals I met individually with on their property site, post, setting up the community meetings and then them scheduling a meeting with me on site in person, and the things that they had been hearing from the homeowners association and their interpretation directly quoted to me in person. So not anecdotal, but again, I apologize if I made it seem dramatic or that there was pressure, but from the 2 that I spoke to individually, there absolutely was a misunderstanding, and that's what they told me to my face. As far as compliance goes and voluntary or not, yes, we did send out an initial letter in January of this year informing them that in our belief that the program is not voluntary. Most of the properties that were identified through the 2010 periodic inspection, the spring and fall levy inspection reports by the state, as well as our own internal survey through the FMAP program as part of the SWIFT program and development and internal, takes a while to process those surveys. We created a list based on the 100 high hazard encroachments. Out of the 600 properties that were surveyed, there were 100 that were identified as high hazard. They were immediately implemented this year after doing a re-inspection to make sure we have the list correct. We did that internally and provided that mailing notice to those 100 properties. As far as their involvement in the development of that survey and consultation, we sent that out. We provided 4 different community workshops and multiple mailers and in-person meetings. The district has spent a significant amount of time working with the property owners since January. And so we feel that we've done above and beyond what normal local public agencies would do in this regard. And we feel that we've done significant outreach. I do want to point out that we've offered to the Garden Highway Community Association on 4 different occasions. I've personally reached out to attend one of their meetings, and I have yet been able to attend one of those, as they have not invited me or included me in those meeting requests, but we continue to make sure that they know that we're available to meet with them. So we do have about 50% compliance at this point. Our board will be discussing probably in between August and September the next steps. And I do want to point out that this isn't RD1000's interpretation. This isn't RD1000's ability to negotiate with the property owners, or as Mr. Ardetti pointed out, to reach agreement that and some assurances. They had assurances from an agreement that they reached with Safeca, but things change. The agreement that they believe they have with Safeca and the settlement agreement that was referenced from Mrs. Brown's documents provided, RD1000 is not party to that. We continue to receive inadequate ratings on our spring and fall levee inspection reports. This is not RD1000's interpretation. This is from DWR, from the state, or from the spring and fall levee inspection reports, as well as affirmation from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that the access and visibility standards continue to be minimally acceptable. And so this is not RD1000 interpreting, this is not RD1000, and we don't have the ability to reach consensus or assurity or provide any assurance because regulations do change. We're not the regulator, we're the local maintaining agency. And I want to point out that we're not the enforcement agency either. We're literally trying to do a project with them to keep them out of enforcement action. So I want to leave with that, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. King. I think we can understand that. We know who the enforcement is. That's why we like to hear from people. Mr. Eric? Oh, my goodness. Thank you. I did say I would go back to Mr. Countryman. At least 5 of you in the audience have reminded me of that. Mr. Countryman.
Yes, thank you. This thing has got to be heading towards more concern than I thought existed. When Mr. Reinhardt stated, I believe he stated, he may be able to correct this, that in his discussions with the Corps of Engineers, they were going to require the full removal. This has not been the board's policy or position that we're going to remove all the vegetation all the way out to the water. I think it would be ridiculous if that was what we had to do. And I'm hoping that we're not committing ourselves to some sort of position that we agree with the Corps of Engineers on that. With the setback levy that we have there, it's really impossible to make an engineering judgment that that should be done. So I think we should strive somehow, if it's possible, to give assurance to the landowners that we're not going there. We're not going out with that exhibit that was presented by RD1000 that showed the emergency stuff and then, you know, the vegetation all the way out to the river. And if the statement is true, the Corps is saying that that needs to be removed, all that vegetation. I would totally disagree with that. And I don't want to, I hope the board is not being put in a position that we're agreeing with the Corps of Engineers on that. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Countryman. The board has adopted a resolution on the vegetation. We are not laying down in front of the Corps.
President Dolan, if I could clarify, I didn't mean to imply that all the vegetation requirement, vegetation was going to need to be removed. The cross-section that was put up describes the different vegetative characteristics of each zone that will be required. There is no tree removal required. You have to take a careful look at each of the zones to see generally beyond the levee toe, the waterside toe, and just to be clear, the waterside toe of the Garden Highway is and remains the waterside toe of the federal project levee system and the state plan of flood control system. But vegetation waterward of the toe, isn't being affected. And depending on the distance from the fog line, the requirements change. It's more aggressive near the top of the levee and gets less aggressive as you move down the slope. And you just have to look at the notes on that graphic that tell you exactly what's required. And that is the Corps of Engineers graphic. It's not RD 1000s. Thank you.
Yes, I think we, Mr. Reinhardt was speaking. I would like to say, and I'm not sure everyone's, you don't all need to agree with me, but I'm going to say the board is really aware of how delicate this issue is. And we understand homeowner concerns because we are. And we do try to find that balance. We appreciate the partnership and particularly the significant funding and assistance that the Corps provides to improve flood protection. This is a dance, and it's something that we have been trying to resolve. The Corps establishes policies that fit the United States of America and not necessarily California's Central Valley. So we work on it. And we held this today not to have a you said, he said, clarification upon clarification, but to just bring the information forward and say, we're aware, we're working on it, we're not going to choose sides today other than safety and appropriateness.
Sorry, President Dolan, I should have announced myself before I spoke. Rick Reinhardt with MBK Engineers on behalf of RD 1000.
Well, thank you. I forgot to do that as well, so there you are. Jeremy Eric from the Department of Water Resources he put in before y'all, but I called you first. I will do board members, public, and then staff. So good morning. It is still morning.
I was hoping to go last. Thank you, President Dolan, members of the board. Good morning. My name is Jeremy Eric with the Department of Water Resources. I am the manager for the Division of Flood Management. Thanks for having this discussion today. I think it's really important. Thanks for providing me the opportunity to comment. I've appreciated hearing from RD 1000 and their efforts and initiatives, which in large part are consistent with the state's goals and objectives. I also appreciate hearing and understanding the perspectives of the property owners that have spoken today and, spoken on behalf of other property owners. And, something that Mr. Reinhardt just mentioned reminded me to state that my comments today are not just about this Garden Highway levee stretch. The state, DWR, and the Flood Board are responsible for over 1,600 miles of levees throughout the Central Valley, Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys. So my comments apply broadly to all those levees and systems. This Garden Highway levee is fairly unique in that there's a large waterside berm that separates the normal water level to the higher high flow waterside toe. So since adoption of the 2012 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, DWR has been and will continue working with the board to present California's views on levee vegetation management, which include a science-based approach to risk reduction while maintaining critical habitat values. It's something I haven't really heard much today is talking about the habitat values that the vegetation and the trees provide out there and throughout the system. As part of the state's levee vegetation management approach that's outlined in the 2012 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, our DWR levee inspections focus on the entire landside slope of the levee and beyond, as well as the upper portion of the waterside slope. We have visibility and accessibility criteria that is outlined in our criteria as well as the CVFPB, and that's what we follow. And it sticks to the upper waterside slope, and I want to emphasize that because of some comments I'll make later. So I heard that, in this particular case, there's a phase one, and we agree with needing to be able to see beyond the upper third of the water, or through the upper third of the waterside slope, for accessibility and visibility reasons. Not just during inspection season to see what's going on down there, but during high water. We need to be able to see if there's active erosion occurring, if another encroachment or something is having an issue. And again, throughout the entire system, this is important to be able to respond to any type of situations that may arise early, as early as they can be found. And oftentimes the patrols are done at night when it's very hard to see. So that clear thinning and trimming of trees and vegetation is greatly important. And while we support and we find compatible vegetation management or removal along, again, the upper waterside slope, we do not promote strict adherence to visibility and accessibility criteria that would be used to justify vegetation removal all the way down the waterside slope to the waterside toe. According to the best available science, which DWR has spent countless dollars, time, and energy into over the past decade or so, as well as decades of levee vegetation management experience, removal or strict management of lower waterside vegetation is neither necessary nor a cost-effective use of resources and effort to reduce levee failure events. There are situations out there where we need to pay attention to lower waterside vegetation. There are situations out there where trees or vegetation may pose a threat to levee integrity, but those need to be handled on a case-by-case basis, not a wholesale. We need to have visibility and accessibility all the way to that lower waterside slope, because one size does not fit all in this situation. Let's see. FMAP. So Mr. Shapiro talked about DWR's FMAP program, and the state has provided funding and will continue to provide funding through that program to local maintaining agencies to bolster their funding sources for levee maintenance in general. We want to be clear that that all of our financial assistance programs, all of our activities and actions that DWR does are done in adherence and consistent with the CVFPB. So I mentioned the CVFPB's levee vegetation management strategy, the management of the upper waterside slope. Our FMAP program is no different. So the funds that we provided are intended to be used along the upper waterside slope, and the fact that we provide funds for levee maintainers is not an endorsement of taking care of vegetation all the way down to the waterside toe. Let's see. I agree also with Mr. Shapiro that RD 1000 is the tip of the spear. I'm glad this conversation is being held. It will increase. The Army Corps is holding a workshop in August to talk about this issue. So we look forward to attending that on behalf of the state. I mentioned the balance. So we need to balance flood risk reduction with our habitat values. There are multiple standards out there. It's confusing. It's confusing for us. It's hard to implement. We have our levee vegetation or our levee inspection criteria that we follow. The Corps of Engineers has their levee inspection criteria that they follow. Sometimes those reports conflict. We've tried to align those as best as possible over the years, and the board's been a big part of that. But our job as a state is to take a reasonable and measured approach to levee management and vegetation management. Because again, that vegetation serves a critical value to our habitat and our species. And we need to pay attention to flood risk reduction. So we look forward to working with the board, continue to work with the board, the Army Corps, and the LMAs on taking a science-based approach to risk reduction and levee vegetation management. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for your comments. It is something that the flood board, its staff, and the board members are working with DWR on. So I like that. The standard is reasonableness. Any questions?
Yeah, through the chair. First of all, I'd like to thank DWR and the RD for, having this grant to offset these costs for the property owners that complied with the program. I mean, you don't see that at every level, other opportunities for other areas in the state where, most of the time the property owners have to bear the cost of being in compliance. So that's number one, is that's great that there was an opportunity for that to happen. The other thing, and it hasn't been mentioned, and I think it should be mentioned, is that, the upstream communities, specifically Yuba and Sutter and even Butte, are doing these strengthening their levees. And in the past, They were the relief valve that actually, you know, so that the waters didn't impact the Sacramento area. We had the flood of '86, the flood of '97. If those waters were allowed to come down to the Sacramento areas, I hate to think what would have happened. You know, we're in a more rural community, even though the impacts were awful for us in the north area. These are things that have to be considered, is that that water is coming down in their direction. And so looking at the amount of, you know, the programs that are happening here is really instrumental and vital for the safety of the folks that live in this area. I'm speaking from my perspective as somebody who worked on with Three Rivers on strengthening those levees. That's something that has to be realized here. The other thing is that there seems to be, you know, there's always a miscommunication when we come to these points, you know, about he said, she said, we believe this, that, another. But I heard an opportunity here today with the Homeowners Association. I heard an opportunity for there to be more discussion, and I heard the opportunity from Mr. King that wants to work with the homeowners too. And I think that, you know, they need assurances that this step, if there was 100% compliance, what happens after that? Is there a step two? What's the possibility of there being a step two if they comply with this 100%? And I think that's the opportunity right there, is to have further discussions on that. The way people feel about government right now, we have to do over and above what we are required by law to do in order to make sure that people understand the risk here. I've seen, you know, boils, you know, half a mile away from the levees. You know, they're fine when they're running clear water, but when they're not running clear water, that's a problem. And it's been stated here today that a lot of this stuff happens at nighttime, and there is no way that you can see what's going on those levees at nighttime with vegetation that's, you know, higher than it should be. So I think the other issue that came up was this new levee that, you know, has been built. How does that work with where they're at? I think that there needs to be a greater understanding about how that water engineering happens, and how, you know, and is it the cure for everything that involves the folks that live along those areas? That needs to be clarified. So those are my thoughts on today's discussion, and I hope that, that we get to a point where we can sit around the table and have that discussion. And I know for myself, and I know the board members always want to come to a resolution and not have to use that enforcement. Thank you.
It's on and not on. That happens. Do you have more remarks?
I'll just say it. Oh, thank you.
Oh, yes.
Thank you, Board Member Grego, for your comments. And I just wanted to, based on the last thing you said about this, I'll call it the adjacent levee. My understanding is the Army Corps' variances do apply in a situation like this where there is an adjacent levee as one option. So I just encourage folks to, you know, attend that August the Army Corps workshop, because I believe that will be discussed a little bit further, so we'll have a chance to better understand how that actually works.
I know that we're preparing for that. This is difficult. Thank you, Mr. Eric.
Thank you.
And thank you, Board Member Grego. You saved me from saying a little bit of what you said. You have great experience, and I appreciate you sharing that. Mr. Countryman, I'm advised you have your hand up again.
This mute thing is
Fun,
tricky.
isn't it?
I would say Jeremy's comments went a long way to help me feel better about everything that went here, because I certainly would have strong opposition to a program beyond what we've heard this planning today. I think it would be, well, Jeremy expressed everything that I think needs to be said, and I thank him for it.
Thank you. Thank you. We thank the board because we're working with DWR on those comments as well. I don't see anyone else here with hands up. I don't see that there's any virtual hands up. Is that correct?
No hands online.
All right. I'm going to call right now for a 10-minute break. I'm going to talk with our staff to sort of see how we proceed, which is a little over our anticipated time. So a 10-minute break, and thank you all for being here. Appreciate your input. There's a break.
The workshop?
Yeah, the Market Square workshop.
Yeah.
Easily finding it.
You know, I think it's in August. We'll find it. Yes? We're going to reconvene, but not for super long. Here's the plan. The next item and the next consideration is a workshop on aspects of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan update. Two subject matters, the conservation strategy and operation and maintenance. Our staff, who is the board's lead on this plan update, Ruth Darling, is going to provide some background information. We believe it takes about 10, 12 minutes, and then we'll take a lunch break. So we're reconvening. I do have Vice President Vines, Board Member Grego, President Dolan. Do I have the three that are on? Ramirez, Countryman, Johnson? Yes. All right. Then the board is reconvening. You missed what I said, so we'll do it later. And I'm going to call on Ruth Darling. What is your branch name?
Flood Planning and Programs Branch.
Flood Planning and Programs Branch. All I know is you do a great job.
Thank you.
So let me turn it to you to introduce aspects of this work item.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. Are we afternoon yet? Almost. President Dolan, Vice President Valines, and members of the board. Ruth Darling, I'm a program manager with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. And today is the first of 3 planned public workshops on the public draft of the 2022 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan update. The goal of these workshops is to take a deeper dive into the comments received on the public draft as well as the conservation strategy. The Flood Protection Act of 2008 states that after comments are received on the flood plan and considered on the flood plan by the department as well as the flood board, the board has the discretion to revise the plan prior to adoption. So workshops are intended to conduct a dialogue between the board, DWR, and the public, and to consider the comments and any potential revisions to the plan. Next slide, please. So I'll just provide a brief overview of our planned workshop schedule. Next slide, please. So this is our proposed schedule for the workshops as well as the board's adoption process. Today, July 15th, we'll be covering comments on the conservation strategy as well as operation and maintenance. On August 5th, we will be covering funding and policy recommendations as well as our call to action. So the call to action is a joint effort between the flood board and DWR and will reside at the front of the final draft of the flood plan. On August 12th, we will be covering climate change. And at the August 26th board meeting, there will be an informational briefing on the draft resolution. And we are proposing the adoption date for the flood plan at our October 28th board meeting. Next slide, please. So an overview of comments received on the public draft. Next slide, please. So here is a compilation of comments received by organization. We've received comments from over 20 agencies. That includes our partners at our regional flood management planning groups. Next slide, please. And so reviewers were asked to indicate their importance of the comments. So they were asked to rank between major, moderate, minor, or often, as you can see, at 80% were left blank. We received over 255 comments, and some of the comments have been summarized into themes. So just an example of some of the themes that we have compartmentalized comments into are things like climate change, agricultural sustainability, comments on equity, investment and financing, performance tracking, policy issues and recommendations. Next slide, please. So the recommended pathways to adoption, that top box are where comments are received, and they'll be addressed via distinct pathways. So comments will either result in revisions to the draft 2017 CVFPB update that will be reflected in the final draft of the flood plan. They can also be addressed in the board's resolution of adoption, or they can be addressed in the 27 update or future updates, as well as other state processes. So this refers to things like the California Water Plan, or things that are consistent with the state's water planning, and as well as additional flood planning. And there's also an other bucket. So these are things that, like comments that request editorial changes, or maybe are outside of the scope of the flood plan, but are often brought up in a lot of our committee meetings, things like advisory committee meeting, coordinating committee meeting. But, you know, as the public venue for the flood plan, the board often hears of items that agencies or nonprofits or folks living and operating within the flood system would like to see changed, and they address those through committees, and oftentimes are outside of the scope of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. And so those pathways will lead to the Central Valley Flood Protection Board's adoption of the flood plan. Next slide, please. So that first box that you saw on the last slide, the revisions to the draft of the 2022 update may include the following. So those are modifications based on public comment as well as board direction. Those might be editorial changes or edits for consistency, or minor clarifications that will be reflected in the plan. And so through this workshop process, the board will consider the extent and importance of revisions from the public to the final draft. Next slide, please. And that's where my part ends. And Mary and David Martesian would resume, going over comments on the conservation strategy and operation and maintenance. So if you wanted to break now, this would be the appropriate time.
I think it will be, but let me see if the board members have any questions for clarification with you. What you have covered now is items 4B and C. B as in Bob, C as in cute. So that's information on us. And I understand there is a very large spreadsheet that has been prepared of comments and a discussion underway of where does it fit. So I appreciate that you showed that. And the board will be considering all of that as we move toward our adoption. The workshop is to provide that overview and information for discussion and questions. So any questions for clarification or any of that? Not from the present. Any hands up from board members?
No hands online.
All right. Any hands up in the room? I see none. Any hands up of others non-board?
No hands online from.
All right. Thank you very much. We're going to take 25 minutes now. Go. Break. That doesn't, oh, there it is. That was Jane Dolan's version of 25 minutes. But I also needed people to come back in the room. So there we are. The board is reconvening on this workshop. We are now at item 4D, as in Dolan. And I'm inviting forward Mary Jimenez of DWR. She is the lead of the plan update team for DWR, so she will provide information regarding the draft and the update. Good afternoon. How's your morning?
Good afternoon.
It's on.
Thank you, President Dolan, and good afternoon, everyone. This is Mary Jimenez with the Department of Water Resources. Pleased to take over the next segment of the workshop today. I really appreciate the introductory remarks from board staff Ruth Darling before the lunch break, and so we're ready to take over from here. Next slide. So I'll just provide some brief introductory remarks to the next segment before handing off to David Martasian, who's the lead of the Conservation Strategy Update and a key member of our flood planning team to lead the rest of the presentation that we have today. So we're here today to discuss the subset of public comments received related to the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan update and specifically the conservation strategy components of that update. Since close of comments on June 6th, our team at the department has completed evaluation of those comments and worked with board staff to categorize those into themes, as Ruth Darling mentioned. We're beginning to think through some revisions that we could propose to address some of these comments, but really that's just the beginning. So we look forward to hearing from the public and from the board to get to the board's direction on which revisions that we should make to the document in order to provide a final version that reflects those important changes. I wanted to mention today that while we are focused on the conservation strategy related comments to the flood plan, the team does intend to carry through related revisions within the suite of documents as needed. So for instance, it may require revisions to not only the CVFPB itself and the conservation strategy, but could also result in revisions to the appendices. So both the appendices to the conservation strategy as well as the flood plan. And specifically within the flood plan, I wanted to call attention to Appendix C, which is the supplemental policy recommendations, which is yet another document associated with the policy issues and many of the things that we're going to discuss. And so the team is ready to receive the board's direction on these. And with that, we'll see if David Martasian is ready to take over on the next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I'm being texted by board members who are online.
Okay.
They're all right. So is David Martasian?
And David, are you on?
Are you ready? Are you on?
Just needed to wait to be unmuted. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Countryman will give you direction on how to unmute.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Board President Dolan, Vice President Valines, and members of the board. I'm here today to talk about some of the comments that we've received on the CVFPB. I guess I should reintroduce myself really quickly. David Martasian, Department of Water Resources. I'm the section manager for the system-wide environmental support section, and as Mary just said, the lead for the conservation strategy development in the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, and one of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan key members. Anyway, today I'm going to focus on the category of comments that we received on the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan that significantly overlap with those we received on the CVFPB's conservation strategy comments, and have relationships to both, as Mary just highlighted. Thank you, Ryan. Those categories include considering adding additional target species to our current list, how measurable objectives are accounted for, wildlife-friendly ag, aquatic weeds, data gaps, and one landscape. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we received comments about adding an additional target species to our current list of 20. Of the 3 species recommended for inclusion, the monarch butterfly meets the conservation strategy criteria. As a reminder, there are 3 specific criteria for inclusion of target species in the conservation strategy. Whether or not it is a sensitive or special status species, that they are associated with target habitats and potential CVFPB effect. DWR is recommending adding the monarch as another target species to this list and revising the documents to include it both in the CVFPB and the conservation strategy. Next slide, please. We received multiple comments questioning what projects should count toward meeting the conservation strategy measurable objectives. We are clarifying how, whether and how implemented projects are meeting the conservation strategy measurable objectives in these projects. Maybe somebody could mute.
Hang on, David. Any idea what that feedback is? Someone needs to mute themselves if they're talking to someone else. Okay, got quiet. Please proceed, Mr. Bartasian. Sorry.
He has to unmute himself again.
You're not unmuted. David?
Thank you. That was not me. Thank you. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So we're clarifying whether and how implemented projects are meeting the conservation strategy measurable objectives in these projects: Southport, Feather River Setback, Conservation Bank, Lookout Slough, Big Notch, and the Hallwood Side Channel project. And also whether or not temporary uplift contributes to the measurable objectives. Essentially what counts as a multi-benefit project. Appendix F of the conservation strategy explains the rationale used to determine whether projects meet the conservation strategy measurable objectives. We are proposing to revise the conservation strategy, specifically in Appendix F and other places where appropriate, to include the Hallwood Side Channel project as an ongoing project. Next slide, please. We also received quite a few comments about agriculture and its role in flood management and benefits to target species. And these comments suggested elevation of sustainable agriculture in the CVFPB and the conservation strategy, and addition of a definition of wildlife-friendly agriculture. They further pointed to California Water Code providing for inclusion of wildlife-friendly agriculture in the CVFPB. We propose to expand the description of sustainable and wildlife-friendly ag in the CVFPB and the conservation strategy, and leverage content from the 2016 conservation strategy and 2017 CVFPB. We do not recommend making substantive changes to the CVFPB goals or policy issue categories at this time. Next slide, please. Okay, aquatic weeds. We received comments regarding the presence of non-native aquatic weeds in the flood system as an impediment to native species recovery. The comments suggested adding aquatic weeds as a high priority for invasive plant removal. Aquatic weeds contribute to increased flood maintenance issues. They affect flood conveyance, flood facilities, and their operation, including fish ladders and inspections. No particular species of aquatic weeds were noted in comments, but it could include weeds like water hyacinth and water primrose. There is potential for aquatic weed control actions to contribute to species recovery, and suggestion that conservation strategy measurable objectives for invasive plant stressors be revised to include that. in the future. We propose to add a description of the problems associated with aquatic weeds to the conservation strategy. And I'd like to just take a moment to highlight the recent Sutter Bypass and Sutter Collecting Canals project as a recent example of aquatic weed removal that supported fish movement up the Sutter East Barrow Canal. Next slide, please. So we received comments about addressing data gaps. And as funding and collaboration opportunities arise and how we fill those data gaps and implement recommendations. Focusing on funding of multi-benefit projects through grants and other programs, and some examples of research partnering and documentation to fill these gaps include things like updates to fish passage barriers within DWR's House of Expertise, and the ecosystem floodplain inundation potential EcoFit FloodMar work that we've been doing with some of our partners within the department. We will consider working on developing work plans collaboratively to address high priority CVFPB recommendations, including addressing data gaps. Some, for instance, might be scoped with RFMPs or the Central Valley Flood Protection Board or others. And we propose refining the text in the CVFPB to describe prioritization and work plan development processes. And I also want to say that there's more discussion around CVFPB policy issues more broadly expected in our August 5th board workshop. Next slide, please. So one landscape approach, I want to touch on this category of comments we received that spoke largely to the collaboration across DWR programs to take a one landscape approach that achieves the objectives of multi-programs and multi-societal benefits in the same space. For example, some of the groundwater recharge I just cited in the EcoFit FloodMar work that we're doing, and carbon sequestration or other similar endeavors. We're using the momentum and investment of other programs like the voluntary agreements and flood managed aquifer recharge, FloodMar, to help fill conservation strategy data gaps. Again, that ecological floodplain inundation potential, or EcoFIP, and meet conservation strategy measurable objectives. We don't plan to add more detail about internal DWR collaboration into the CVFPB and CS documents. Next slide, please. So maybe before I dive into this, I should pause and see if there's any questions or comments on the ones I just touched on relative to the conservation strategy, because I'm shifting gears a little bit here into operations and maintenance and the comments we received relative to that.
Yes, I would like to start. This is Jane Dolan. You listed certain bullet points of items where there was an indication that there was a number of commenters who asked for certain things. And then, and that was on your PowerPoint, those bullet points. But then you verbally said ways you're thinking of handling them. And I was trying quickly to write notes on that. Perhaps you don't have to restate those, but I guess I could listen to the recording, but perhaps you could provide us with some bullet point that says, this is what we think we want to do with this certain item. I was writing it all down and it all seemed very reasonable to me, but I can't write as fast as I hear.
Sorry if I was speaking too fast.
You were not, and I really appreciate that you're highlighting what commenters said, but maybe. Do
you want me to kind of run down really quickly some of these things? I mean, like, for example, for the Monarch, we're proposing adding that as a fourth target species
Okay.
to the 3 we've already proposed for
Okay.
new species.
Are you going to add more information regarding measurable objectives? Or you think it's covered?
For the measurable objectives, we do want to add the Hallwood side channel,
Okay.
which was brought to our attention through public comment that we had missed that
Okay.
as an ongoing project that we should incorporate and count. I don't believe we are thinking of making additional significant changes in how we are accounting or what we assign, yes, this counts, or no, this doesn't count.
Okay.
But we do want to account for Hallwood side channel, which we did not count at this point.
Understood. Okay.
Okay.
And I think I understand your others, so I'm not asking you to go through
Okay.
what you're thinking on the other ones there, the weeds and the data gaps and the one landscape approach. I think I understand that.
All right.
Thank you. So before we go on to operation and maintenance, I see Ms. Darling at the podium. Do you have comments here?
Well, I was going to offer some of what David was saying because I have it in notes as well. So I'm just here as support, but was there any questions on any of the measurable objectives online or in the audience? Greg, would you mind going back to slide 13, I think it is? Keep before that one. And again, sorry, it's this slide. So I know this issue, you know, what counts as a multi-benefit project came up quite a lot in advisory committee. So I'm just wanted to pause here and see if there was anything that needed to be addressed further.
That did indeed come up a lot. It does come up a lot. And then also what to count in the plan, what's mitigation, what's uplift. These are challenging topics to come to a consensus of definition. Do we see anyone with hands raised online?
No hands raised online.
Okay, and I see none in the room.
Okay,
So,
I think we can move on then, David.
board members? Board members online?
No hands raised from the board members either.
Okay. All right, back to you, Mr. Martasian.
And Greg, I think that would be slide 18 to start on.
That's it. No. Ruth, which one should it be on? Seems like we went forward a little too much. That's it. Summary comments, operation and maintenance slide. Mr. Martasian. You're muted, sir.
I know, and I can't unmute myself. Oh, now I'm unmuted. Okay,
Oh, is that
thank you.
right? I didn't know you were
I have no
being-
control over my mute function. If I muted myself so I didn't make any background noise while Ruth was speaking, and then I'm not allowed to unmute myself. So just for situational awareness.
We can hear you now.
Okay, good.
Yes.
So we're back to the summary of comments on operation and maintenance. So this slide just summarizes the next 3 O&M related topics that we received comments on and have relevance to both the CVFPB and the main document and the conservation strategy. A big one is resolving conflict related to perpetual protection of habitat mitigation in the floodway. Also incorporation of long-term O&M into project implementation, permitting, and finally, how we manage multi-benefit O&M. Next slide, please. So we received comments that highlighted the challenges relative to mitigation and protection of those features in the floodway in perpetuity. Maintenance and flood features require flexibility, and incorporation of long-term O&M in project planning is also complex. To give a specific example, an excerpt of a comment, there was a recommend including a discussion that speaks to the need for flexibility of maintenance requirements for projects that increase ecosystem functions in the floodway without increasing potential flood risk. There needs to be a conversation between the CVFPB, local maintainers, resource agencies, and NGOs about how to build flexibility into permits and processes that require maintenance for projects that improve ecosystem functions when those improvements come with little to no increases in flood risk. So the conservation strategy includes this, along with early engagement workshops and developing guidance for project proponents to optimize permitting. But we're proposing refinement of text in the CVFPP and the conservation strategy where related policy issues are described for this. Should I pause here, President Dolan, for any additional discussion on this? I have 2 more slides relative to O&M, or would you like me to proceed through the next 2 slides?
Thank you for asking that. I think what I will do is, there's a beautiful floral bouquet for our executive officer that's blocking me from Ryan Jones, but I'm going to ask him to let me know when there's a hand raised. Otherwise, you may proceed.
Okay, thank you. We can move to the next slide then.
Yes.
So relative to incorporating long-term O&M into project permitting, another set of comments focused on that. They address the challenges associated with O&M permitting and compliance, along with increased costs of implementation. These, as I noted in the last slide, are complex problems spanning federal, state, and local entities. The YOLO Bypass Cash Loop program is developing a master plan that includes O&M as part of long-term permitting approach. Developing MOUs between DWR and the LMAs and regulatory agencies, as well as developing templates for O&M with standardized avoidance and minimization measures are a possibility that could provide guidance for long-term maintenance of restoration projects. And some of that language is in both the CVFPP and the conservation strategy. It includes components of that, and certainly has this highlighted as a high priority recommendation. We at this time propose refining the description of the related policy issues and recommendations, along with some text related to the YOLO Bypass Cash Loop program. Next slide, please. So another comment we got was relative to O&M of multi-benefit projects. And the comments suggested a lack of clarity on multi-benefit O&M liabilities and responsibilities and the funding mechanisms associated with them. Explicit excerpt was evaluate establishment of a multi-benefit O&M entity with responsibility for and funding support to operate and maintain multi-benefit elements, projects within the state plan of flood control footprint. We're proposing to refine our description of related policy issues and recommendations, along with text related to this in the YOLO Bypass Cash Loop program, but are opening it up to discussion at this point, as that's my last slide.
Well, this is Jane Dolan again. These are really complex issues. Did the commenters want resolution full definition, or were they indicating that there needed to be some expression that work needs to be done on these? Because some of them are not one size fits all.
I hesitate to speculate what their exact desire was in the comments. But
Okay.
if I think there is a recognition, the commenters put a lot of thought into what they gave us. And I think there's recognition that these things are not magic wand, wave it, put it in the plan, and it's fixed.
Yes, and
I think there's
all of these, as you know, the advisory committee had really robust and helpful discussions on all of these.
Correct.
They're real. They need addressing. Some of them are geographically based. Others are policy based. So we're not going to. So basically, the plan's not going to ignore them, but we're in this iteration can't solve them all. I guess is my.
If I were to broadly speculate, yes, that is. But on a case by case basis, some of them there may be room to expand our dialogue on them. Some of them may not. May need to find another venue to expand the dialogue, or we need to be part of that dialogue.
Yes, and once the plan is adopted, the discussion doesn't stop on any of these things, nor the work, nor the effort. So just remind folks of that. Okay. I see a hand raised. Mr. Reinhardt. If you're on my left side of the room, I can't see if you raise your hand unless it's really high, because the podium is blocking.
Thank you, President Dolan. Rick
Yes.
Reinhardt with MBK Engineers here on behalf of the Flood Control Association. I'm very appreciative that the department has highlighted this point for discussion, and I agree that that there's a lot here to work on, and that the important thing for the 2022 update is that acknowledge the dialogues that need to occur, and we continue to make progress on it as we focus on the 2027 update. But I did want to talk about specifically one aspect of this. We, over the past couple of years, have talked about the difficulty in implementation, moving from planning to implementation. And I am seeing in the world I work in where this issue is an impediment to implementing multi-benefit projects. And I want to give you an example. So I have an environmental NGO I'm working for who wants to do a restoration project in the floodway. So we've prepared an encroachment permit application. We need to submit that to FMO for endorsement as the LMA. And what I see we're up against is decades of tension between flood interests and the resource agencies, where flood has an obligation to maintain for flood control, and with ESA and CEQA, flood control has not been able to accomplish their mission. They haven't been funded to address O&M with the mitigation that would occur with environmental laws that have been passed, and so that's a big reason that we have such a large deferred maintenance backlog. So rightfully, when a new permit comes to FMO, they're going to be cautious about endorsing a permit that has the potential to increase their obligation with no funding. And so that's the first hurdle we face, is getting through the endorsement with FMO. And I don't think FMO is being unreasonable. I understand where they're coming from, but nonetheless, it is an impediment. And then honestly, the next impediment is your board. One of the conditions, special conditions that you put in your permit, has to do with ensuring long-term O&M is addressed, and it's a pretty open-ended obligation. I've heard this from Solano County Water Agency, who has lamented about some of the permit conditions that have been placed on their project and their unwillingness to proceed with future projects because of that obligation. And I've dealt with this with other public agencies. And so what I want your takeaway to be is, as we continue to move forward, is recognize that this O&M issue is an impediment to projects going forward, and from applicants even bringing projects forward because of what they see as an open-ended burden. Hopefully that's helpful as you finalize the 2022 plan in shaping this as a barrier to implementation, and we can work together through the advisory committee to come up with solutions and present those in the 2027 plan. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
We may not have to wait to 2027 to come up with some solution.
Through the chair.
Board member first, is that all right?
That's fine.
I'm sorry.
Member Grego.
Rick, can you maybe relay any of that with Three Rivers as an example?
Sure. We are working right now on the Feather River Conservation Bank. And we're in conflict between, I believe it's CDFW and DWR of, if DWR has to go in and do maintenance, they have to do maintenance. They have an obligation to pass a 57 profile. But mitigation banks aren't used to having flood as a supreme easement. And so there's a dialogue, which is supreme? Does the obligation to the environment take precedent over whatever the flood needs are, or vice versa? And it's unfortunate. And I think we're going to navigate that one, but the fact that we're hung up on it is disappointing.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's difficult to identify a path that gets to a resolution, and discussion just goes on and on. Okay. Our board counsel has a...
Yes, I just wanted to remind the board that one of the top items that we have identified going forward in revising Title 23 is developing a regulatory scheme that, step back a little bit, I think it's because your mic.
I can hear you.
Thank you. Oh, now it's off. I think I was,
Oh, we're getting some feedback.
I think they need to, okay, it's working now again. That we have identified that we have a need to modernize our regulations even further. We've taken care of the standards, but we understand that many of the projects going forward are going to be multi-benefit, and there's a need to update our regulations to accommodate that, whether it be by a separate scheme within our regulations or redefining some of the regulations that we currently have. So I know that Rick is aware of that. We've been discussing that, and we are talking about some planning meetings to start doing that in collaboration with our partners, obviously.
Okay, we don't have to wait for 2027 to get moving on that. Good. The steps of updating dated regulations are frustrating. So we'll try to move it more. Thanks for your input, Mr. Reinhardt, as always. I don't see any hands raised in the room.
Secretary Johnson has his hand raised.
All right. Secretary Johnson. Who unmutes Secretary Johnson?
Okay, I think I may be unmuted now. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. That means everyone can.
Fantastic, thank you. Sorry I couldn't be there today. I have two things. I to also come back to Mr. Reinhardt and thank him for raising those specifically with us here today. The subject matter you touched on, showed up quite a bit in some of the written comments and are things that we've heard quite a lot about in the advisory committee and, as we go about our work. But I'm glad that you brought them forward to mention them for everybody watching today. And I agree that there are, I do think that we will find a pathway to this, and I'm encouraged that there's a lot.
Member Johnson, I know that you're traveling and you are participating, so thank you for making that attempt. But we're really having difficulty hearing your full words. I don't think we've lost you. So let's see if we can get you back. You had indicated that you'd be traveling, and there might be times that you lose internet capacity. So if we see you come back, we'll see if we can hear you again. But I certainly heard that you were thanking Board Member Johnson was thinking this issue being raised and that it has been an ongoing topic advisory committee, and we'll do the best we can to move this complex issue forward. Any other hands raised? Mr. Jones?
See something in the chat. Just Brian said he's going to try to phone in later.
No other hands.
Okay, we got a communication, I think on a cell, that Mr. Johnson will try to get back on. Okay. We may be over by that time. That's your last slide. So then it goes on to the board members have comments.
Yes, so we can move to the next slide if we haven't already.
I think that we have. I've given mine. Board Member Griego has given some. She certainly has a lot of experience. We certainly know at every single workshop and ultimately on the adoption, we get to say a lot. So Board Member Johnson will try to log back on. It's tough when you're traveling in parts of California where there's no Wi-Fi. Okay, we can go to the next slide. We just have smiling faces here in the room and no hands raised. Any hands raised for those who are participating online?
No hands raised online.
This feels a little bit like the plan hearings. What do you think? I just need to say that I think all of the amazing, proactive, hard work at the stakeholder outreach, where we actually went to communities, RFMPs, boards of supervisors, city councils, various committees and project proponents to have a really almost one-on-one kind of conversation, really assisted in the quality of this draft plan, and that people do feel that they're being heard. I really appreciate the work of Ruth Darling of our staff and the DWR team, Mary Jimenez, Dave Martesian, Jason Sidley. I'm gonna get that wrong, I always do. Like, why I want to call him by my niece's name, Sidley, for all the effort they put into identifying the comments and categorizing them, whether the commenter categorized them or not, and determining how they best can be handled. That spreadsheet is very comprehensive and helpful. We'll have to read it again. So I see no further comments from the board at this point. We will always talk when we want to, nor any comments from the public. So what is left for today, Ms. Darling? You've got the best name.
Thank you. Ruth Darling, Central Valley Flood Protection Board. I was just going to go over real quickly again our proposed schedule for the workshops and adoption process. As a reminder, the August 5th and August 12th workshops will be virtual only. So those will be hosted through the board's WebEx account, and the information for those will be posted on our website as well, with an agenda going out 10 days prior to the meeting date. So August 5th will be funding and policy recommendations, as well as on our draft resolution, and at the October 28th board meeting, the proposed adoption of the 2022 flood plan update. So on August 5th, we will see you all virtually.
It's interesting how we see each other these days. I guess I'm a little surprised at the gap between August and October.
So, and I think perhaps Mary can help me out with this, but pencils need to be down, I believe, at the beginning of September, mid-September. So we'll have the month of September to work on the final in terms of graphics and editing and all the consultant work that goes into preparing the final in September. And then in terms of, we need to hopefully adopt it by October. in terms of funding, as well as, well, mostly funding, but.
As well, yes, as well as meeting the statutory requirement to
Right.
do an adoption. Yes, there are some missing pages. I do know that there's some introductory letters and some gaps and things like
Right.
that. Okay, now I understand that. It's not like we go silent and stop talking about it. It's just there's certain things that need to be done before the formal adoption occurs. Okay, thank you. Clarifies it for me. I hope for others too. We'll always have a spot on board agenda as to what's going on for information. Okay. Those are the items that are listed on the agenda. We had indicated that there's always a potential for closed sessions, and I understand that the only one that was to occur has occurred. Is that correct, Mr. Counsel?
That is correct.
Okay. Someone asked me when we might adjourn. I said 2:30-ish, so I was thinking there would be more. It's 1:30-ish, so without further ado, we are adjourned. Thank you all. Thank you all for your effort.